Goedenavond iedereen. Good evening. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here at Be Unlimited. My name is Sheila Sitalsing and I will be moderating this evening. An evening about anger as a driving force of politics. And we're going to talk about the anger that brought us Trumpism and Brexit and Islamic State and Hindu supremacists in India. And we have two eminent guests to discuss this issue. We're delighted that they're here. On my left-hand side is Pankaj Mishra, Indian essayist and novelist. His essays have been published in the New York Times, in The Guardian, in The New Yorker. He's written a novel called The Romantics, and his works of non-fiction include From the Ruins of Empire. His recent book, Age of Anger, Tijd, Woede, tries to explain the origins of what he refers to as the current great wave of paranoid hatred. Thank you. Welcome, Pankaj. Next to him, Ian Buruma, newly appointed editor of the New York Review of Books and, well, fair to say, the first Dutchman in this position. His writings have been published in major publications like the New York Times, New Yorker. Ian is professor of democracy, human rights, and journalism. No longer. He used to be professor of democracy, human rights, and journalism at Bard College. He's written on Japanese culture, on religion, on the murder of Theo van Gogh. His books include Taming the Gods, Year Zero, and his most recent work, That Promised Land, Hun Beloofde Land. Books are here and there up for purchase later. Welcome, Ian Buruma. I will put these down now, because otherwise people will not be able to see your faces, and that would be a shame. Well, thank you. It's an honor. It's a privilege to have you here. But let's start with you, Ian Buruma. In September, you will be succeeding Robert Silvers as editor of the New York Review of Books. Small magazine, highly influential. And in a recent interview in NRC Handelsblad, you said, well, when Barack Obama was in the White House, one knew that the President of the United States would read this magazine, would read the New York Review of Books. Now that role has changed. We're a voice of the opposition now. Well, that sounds like you're preparing for battle of some sort. How will that echo through in the magazine?
Well, it's already been echoed through the magazine as long as it existed, because it was always a liberal in the American sense, a sort of left-of-center magazine, based on, although you had different opinions expressed by different writers, but the general tone of the magazine, culturally and politically, is everything that Donald Trump and the sort of populist right, not only in the United States, but it's everything they hate. So even if I didn't do my best to be the voice of opposition and make sure we're on top of the Trump story and so on and so forth, we would naturally be the opposition, because it's everything he loathes. Mm-hmm.
Now, Pankaj Mishra, in Age of Anger, you try to dissect how this came about, how it came about that the New York Review of Books became a voice of the opposition and everything Donald Trump loathes. So why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it in the first instance to, first of all, clarify to myself an extremely perplexing, confusing, depressing situation in India, where a man who many of us had denounced and thought had been safely marginalized, excluded from any chances of success in Indian politics, he becomes the Prime Minister in 2014. And for those of you who don't know, he represents, or he has been a member, a lifelong member of movement, Hindu nationalists, which derives direct inspiration from many of the fascist movements and parties of the 1930s. And there are other connections there too. So, and obviously, these people have had this agenda of turning India into a Hindu nation for a very long time. But they were on the margins of Indian political life for a long time too. Some of their former members were involved in the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. Mm-hmm. And after that, for many years, they could not really recover. and it's only in the last 2 decades that they began to emerge. And then most shocking was the election of Mr. Modi, who was chief minister in the state of Gujarat when over 1,000 Muslims were killed in what was essentially a pogrom. It's not quite clear to what extent he was himself complicit in this.
But it was on his responsibility. It happened on his watch.
He refused to condemn it. He refused to apologize for it. Many of his ministers were involved, and they were identified, and one of them has been serving a long sentence, except that she's now out. I mean, a lot of people who were put in prison for that are roaming free at present. So he was just absolutely the wrong kind of person to become the prime minister of the world's, what is often known as the world's largest democracy.
And
so that came as a
elected.
shock to many of us who had, obviously I have been a critic of many aspects of Indian democracy, but I had never expected that, such a man, it would throw up a figure like that. And it was really to understand why people elected him, including people from my own family, also friends of mine, old friends of mine who I've known for a long time, all voted for him. There was a wave across India that he is the man to save the country. And he's the man to restore us the glory and power that is our due as Indians.
Is it sort of a strong leader fantasy?
Very much so, very much so. I mean, people projected different fantasies into him, but the most significant one politically was that he is going to resurrect India and restore it to its rightful place internationally. He's going to make it strong militarily, economically. And there was a whole kind of rhetoric of, strength, power, 56-inch chest, so a whole kind of masculine rhetoric that we've heard from Putin and
sounds
Trump,
like make America great
size
again.
of a particular, sort of body parts, and this kind of rhetoric obviously appealed to a lot of people, and also minority baiting going on at the same time. So it was really to understand what had happened there that I began to write. And then as I was writing it, other things started to happen. The far-right movements have been around for a long time, but they began to grow in strength. And then Brexit happened, Trump happened. It became, in a strange way, a book for this moment, even though I was initially focused on the experience of India.
Okay. Now you attribute the roots of anger to, actually modernity itself, this ideal of everybody enjoying fruits of freedom, personal freedom, individualism, stability, democracy, free market economy, and that has turned into a disappointment, a sense of loss, and a source of anger for many people. Now, Ian, do you subscribe to this point of view that it's sort of modernity itself bears so many disappointments that it turns... that people get angry if it doesn't deliver on its promises.
I've never been entirely sure what people meant by modernity. It's one of those words that are always used by social scientists. But before we get into modernity, I'd like to follow up slightly on something Pankaj just said, which is and this is not a disagreement, but about the background of this anger and these populist movements, and that people often talk about it as though it's a sort of Western phenomenon. It's happening in Europe and in the United States, but actually there are very clear parallels in India. And the Hindu nationalist movement that Pankaj mentions, of course, does go back to way before World War II and was directly influenced by European fascism. But I remember, it just came to me, but I remember walking through Lodi Gardens in Delhi with Pankaj, and I can't remember which year it was, more than 20 years ago maybe.
96, isn't it?
Yeah, and we had a discussion. It wasn't particularly an argument, but it was when the Congress Party was still very much in power. And the Congress Party, which of course was a left-of-centre party, was socialist in the sort of Fabian tradition and so on, had been in power more or less since independence, as was true of sort of social democrat, Christian democrat parties in Europe, and had become in a similar kind of way, I think, complacent. And you were very critical then of the Congress Party and even of the Nehruvian tradition, which I think you saw as a kind of upper caste, sort of secular, educated party that was out of touch with a lot of things that were going on underneath in society. And of course we didn't know, I mean, the name Modi didn't come up then, but a lot of the protest against this perceived elite monopoly of power is very similar, I think, to what has happened in Europe and America, where you have people who feel looked down upon, neglected, their voices aren't heard, and so on. And some of this has some truth, and some of it is nonsense. But the same anti-elitist anger, I think, erupted all over, and I think is very analogous. So I would like to ask Pankaj what he now thinks of the Nehruvian tradition and the impact of the rule of the Congress Party in India for so long.
Well, it's interesting that you should mention this, because that's not long after I had been in college in India at a provincial university, which was a pretty dead-end place, of the many, one of the many dead-end places that exist in India today, where the students were there working their way to a degree, but it was clear that there were no jobs for them, that no jobs were going to be created for them, and that they would also have to either go home or start some businesses and so on. And they were all people from provincial backgrounds like myself. And the person we disliked the most was Rajiv Gandhi. This is the late 80s I'm talking about here, mid to late 80s, because he represented this Indian ruling class which was extremely well educated, polished, spoke English fluently, but did not know much about what was happening in the rest of the country, was indifferent to the plight of many people, was extremely self-serving. Rajiv Gandhi had all these people around him who had all been educated in Oxford and Cambridge, and they had come back with all these kind of fantastical ideas about modernizing India. So when you talk about modernity, for a lot of people, modernity seemed like an entirely self-serving project of the elites, that these people are just there to feather their own nests. And that was the perception. So when Modi won with this appeal against dynastic elites, by telling a lot of young Indians that it's these people who have been basically blocking your path to success, is this unaccountable, corrupt, self-serving elite. I really could understand very clearly why he appealed to so many people, because I was one of them.
He had a point.
He had a point. That sort of ressentiment that he tapped into, I was one of those people who had felt that myself, that here were these people who came in after a fancy education elsewhere, moved straight into the highest positions in the country, and then basically, essentially devoted themselves to advancing their own fortunes and those of their family members. Which was, I'm exaggerating obviously, but that was the larger pattern. And so, in retrospect, I think Nehru, of course, was someone who was completely incorruptible, who had a vision for his country, like many post-colonial builders, which was that of taking his country into the modern world, into the industrial economy. And he did many things back in the 50s and 60s that he's not given sufficient credit for. But things began to go wrong in the 1970s. There were all kinds of problems, problems essentially of governability, a large country with all kinds of political, economic crises. And you could already see in the 1970s the shift to authoritarianism with Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. And I think now today we see obviously these crises on a different scale altogether. Hence this appeal of the strong man who can come and sort things out, who can also take out this elite. And a lot of his popularity today comes from this emotional appeal that he makes to a lot of left behind, disadvantaged Indians, that I'm here speaking for you, acting on your behalf, and that I'm the person who can put this elite in its place. Even though he himself is a member of the elite and has been, in sort of colluding with some of the richest people in the country. But nevertheless, the rhetoric is deeply seductive for many people.
Well, in that sense, there's a strong parallel with what's happened in the United States and what's happening on continental Europe to some extent. Do you think it's the same process? It's elites who sort of alienate people, or is it, or are there differences?
Well, obviously there are many local differences, many of them. But if there is one thing that is common to them, it is a sense of, there is a disaffection with people in positions of power and influence in politics, business, media, that this is essentially a minority that has benefited a great deal, whatever you call it, modernity, globalization, that has benefited disproportionately from this.
Because what is, let's define modernity or modernization. How would you define it?
Well, I think, the problem is modernity in India means something else, whereas here it is something, a large part of it is already achieved. So here we are talking about, the kinds of economic ideologies and systems that began to be institutionalized after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're talking here specifically about neoliberalism, a vision in which society is organized around the laws of the marketplace, and the state's role is gradually undermined. So here you have a different version of modernity altogether. And mind you, a lot of this was justified, like Blair's language. He was constantly talking about we have to modernize. And what modernize meant was to basically cut down the state's role in welfare, in redistribution. Whereas for people in India, modernity was a promise of material improvement. It was a promise of equality. It was a promise of, urban existence,
but
moving
so
away.
was neoliberalism and globalization. Ian, do you agree? That was also sort of sold as a means to advance even more in life.
Neoliberalism is really very recent, and we see these problems happening in countries where neoliberalism really never hardly took off. I mean, France in Europe probably has one of the strongest right-wing populist parties, the Marine Le Pen, which has a history and so on, has very little to do with neoliberalism, because the French state is still quite redistributive and still has a lot of the post-war statist system intact. So it can happen in those countries too. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to associate neoliberalism, which became particularly strong in the Anglo-Saxon world, and especially after Reagan, Thatcher in the 1980s and so on, with modernity. I mean, modernity can mean so many things, which is why it's such a slippery concept. I mean, it could also mean a better medical care, female emancipation, and this is where I think perhaps there's some room for disagreement, which would liven up the discussion. That I would put up more of a defense of the Enlightenment than Pankaj does in his book. For example, I don't really subscribe to the caricature of the Enlightenment that it was completely rationalist. That was a small strain of it, but the attack on religion was not so much a rationalist attack, although it included that in some thinkers. It was an attack, particularly in France, on the absolute power of the church, on the idea of revealed truth, that you had to obey the priest because that's what the Bible said,
so it was a revolt against the elites as well, against religious elites.
In a way, absolute monarchy, which that because God had willed it so that you had a king who had absolute power and so on. So the idea, one of the ideals of the Enlightenment, was that through human reason we could emancipate ourselves from that kind of oppression. And many Enlightenment thinkers were also devout Christians. And some of the things which Pankaj, I think, quite rightly criticizes in the book, the way that a lot of Western ideas were imposed on the non-Western world through colonialism and sometimes through violence. But that also is not rationalist so much. That also has a lot to do with Christianity, with the missionary spirit, the idea that we owe it to the world that we liberate them and save their souls and bring them into the bosom of the church and so on. And that, in the end, also translated into the more zealous aspects of the human rights movement. That, we have the human rights we've worked it out in the West, and it's our duty to bring human rights to the rest of the world. Now, that can be zealous, it can be sometimes ham-fisted. On the other hand, do we really want to say that trying to improve human rights in countries where where it's very weak is wrong simply because it's often financed by Western organizations or argued for by Western thinkers? I wouldn't go that far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, the way I have talked about this particular movement of ideas is to set it right in its place, which is to basically say, look, these were children of their time. And they
did speak highly of Voltaire in your book,
yes,
actually.
Yes, for reasons I will soon mention, is that these were members of an ambitious class that was trying to find a space for themselves. And they offered, various ideas of liberation, emancipation. But those ideas were not meant for people from outside their class. They were not meant for the masses. They didn't talk about democracy. So this link that we constantly make between, democracy, the Enlightenment, is a very flawed one. These were people who were trying to create some space for themselves, where they were, fighting against corrupt clerical authority, fighting against monarchy on one side, aristocracy, and they were essentially interested in expanding their power. And of course, reason had a great role to play in this. The way they deployed individual reason, they had to, because they were pushing back against the authority of the church. So this, of course, is something that happens in the late 18th century. People offer universalist solutions, universalist ideas, and anthropological vision of the individual as someone who is guided by self-love, self-interest. Also, of course, reason, the discovery of science can help human beings move forward and so on. Now, the problem is that there are no through lines running through all this. So this is why I don't get into the business of defining what the Enlightenment is. I'm looking at these individuals. I'm looking at their alliances. What are the alliances they are making? Voltaire is a friend of the despots of the day. He wants Enlightenment to be imposed through the barrel of a gun. This is why he's supporting Catherine the Great. He has no time for black people. He thinks they have fewer ideas than animals. We know what he said about the Jews. So why do we construct this sort of cult of the Enlightenment? We have to look at these people as children of the time. I'm not saying he's a racist. Most people were back then. So why is it that their ideas are held to be truly universal, that we should be worshipping, rather than thinking them as people of their times who had certain ideas, some good, some bad? Let's look at what happened in the 19th century. What happened in the 19th century was not anticipated, could not have been anticipated by any of these people. So I think what I'm pushing back against is this notion that these people, with their particular ideas and their particular alliances, they set off this whole, in a way, this process whereby we overvalue these figures, these networked elites, with their ideas of world improvement and massive social re-engineering, which even then they are very happy to pursue through despots. So the alliance that we see today, that we deplore between neoconservatives or neoliberals and powerful people, intellectuals, is something that is already anticipated back in the late 18th century. Mm-hmm. By the alliances between Enlightenment intellectuals and these various despots.
No. Yeah, your sort of hero, if I may say so, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because he warns against individualism. Well, it's he warned against individualism, material progress as an end in itself. So why is he so important?
Well, he's important because I think he offers within the Enlightenment. He's all been upheld as an icon of the counter-Enlightenment. I mean, these binary oppositions, very much a product of the Cold War, where he's very much a figure of the Enlightenment. He is someone who believes that emancipation is a way forward, that we cannot. He's also critical of clerical authority. He's not so much critical of religion itself, but he's critical of those who abuse religion to expand their own power. So he is, in many ways, he's in agreement with the other thinkers of that period. But his critique is really of intellectuals as they formulate ideas of the elite, also a metropolitan elite, as it formulates ideas for other people to follow, and ideas that often end up being imposed violently upon them. So he is someone who's looking at these theories and how people should live, what a good life should consist of, what a good society should consist of, and he's saying this business of self-love, pursuing self-interest, vanity being prized, this is going to leave a lot of human beings extremely unhappy. That freedom is important, but what is freedom to be used for? So that is the question he poses. I mean, there are many other things, obviously. He
and is
also
that a question that's still valid?
So political communities are important. That we need politics.
Yeah.
That is his major contribution. That commerce and science and reason, individual reason, that's not enough. We need to know what forms a political community. And in the process of defining this political community, you can see that all kinds of political tendencies flow from, whether it's cultural nationalism, romantic nationalism of the kind that we've seen many times since then. So he is responding to that project, essentially, of the metropolitan elites and saying that we need a lot more than that. It will leave a lot of...
I'm not sure all this is entirely historically accurate, because on the one hand, it seems contradictory to say that people like Voltaire... First of all, it's an anachronism to criticize him because he wasn't a Democrat. I mean, the liberal...
No, I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying that is a link often made.
Well,
I'm not criticizing
no,
that
democracy in the end flowed from ideas that were then formulated, and I think you can make that case. But to say that he allied himself with despots seems a little tendentious, because what was on offer, I mean, they didn't have liberal democracy in those days, and he allied himself usually with monarchs who were relatively liberal, but he looked up much more to England, which was really his ideal at the time, as a sort of society where reason and individual freedom and so on were further developed than in other places. But I think that Rousseau, in some ways, if you want to say that there is a link between ideas of the 18th century and oppression and despotism and so on in more modern times, I would say Rousseau is more guilty of that than Voltaire, because Rousseau had the notion that that politics and the role of the state was not so much a matter of a contract between the ruler and the ruled, in the way that Locke and others formulated, but that the state represented the will of the people. And that particular idea became very influential in communism and fascism and so on. Again, I'm not to say that Rousseau was either a communist or a fascist. That would be just as anachronistic as to say Voltaire was not really a Democrat. But I think that Rousseau's idea actually was politically more toxic than anything that Diderot or Voltaire said. And there's something contradictory by saying, on the one hand, they were only out for the power of their own elite, and the other hand, that their ideals incorporated improving mankind, universalism, and so on, which was very much part of their thinking. Now, you can't have it both ways. If you're trying to develop ideas to improve mankind, however
yes, but
ill-conceived they may be, but that's not the same thing as that you're trying to find arguments simply to protect the monopoly on power of a small elite.
But the problem is that the rhetoric of universalism always has exclusion built into it. So they are formulating universal ideas, but what does it mean to exclude Jews? What does it mean to exclude blacks from even considering them human? What kind of universalism is this that we are talking about here? So slave owners in America talking about liberty. What kind of liberty is this? So what I'm trying to say, really, I'm not actually drawing through lines between Rousseau, what happened in the 19th century, or what happened in the 20th century. What I'm trying to say is that universalist ideas proposed by a minority of self-serving people, essentially. You know, perfectly right that they were self-serving. What else could they be at that time? But why do we insist on thinking of these people as these great figures that we should be constantly looking up to?
Yeah,
this is what I'm pushing back against.
Again,
I'm not actually holding them responsible for not being interested in democracy or for pioneering fascism. What I'm saying is that these were children of their time, you know, just as we are. So what is this sort of whole rhetoric of universal reason when we know that while they were talking of universalism, they had no time for women, they had no time for blacks, they had no time for Native Americans?
Well,
they were constantly constructing these hierarchies in which people like themselves were superior to all the others.
But that's not quite true.
But
I totally agree that in American history there's a deep contradiction between Jefferson, who on the one hand promoted Enlightenment ideals in science and so on and so forth, and had a system of slavery. That's absolutely accurate. But Voltaire, again, it's more complicated. He didn't exclude Jews. What Voltaire did was that he did indeed have sort of universalist notions, and one of his models was actually China, which he idealized. And he had this notion that and the reason he idealized China is that he thought, he was one of the sort of pioneers of the common European tendency of sort of picking on a country that's very far away and rather unknown to set it up as an ideal with which to criticize your own society. But he idealized China because he saw it as the rational state, as a sort of a state run by educated, rational mandarins who are no longer under the sway of what he calls the bonzes, the Buddhist and other sort of the priestly castes and so on. Now, that he didn't necessarily have a very accurate understanding of China, but that was his idea. His criticism of the Jews and of the Christians, don't forget, was that he saw them as people who were still deluded by believing in the Bible and being religious and so on, and were unenlightened. But he didn't exclude them on racial grounds or because he, in the way that Americans in the 18th and 19th century excluded blacks. So you can't simply tar them all with the same brush.
Yeah, okay, let's move on to modern times. So how does this the Enlightenment translate into today's anger and the eruption of anger that you're describing?
I think what I'm trying to say is that the project of emancipation is formulated, is theorized by a tiny elite and for itself. And what we see then is that project, because it's so seductive, it's so attractive, moving out of all the hierarchies. I felt that attraction myself. Obviously, I'm a beneficiary of that. Custom, tradition, religion, to move out of that, to find a place for yourself in the wider world, to discover the pleasures of having an individual mind, having a perception of your own, that you've shaped with your own reading and thinking about things. Now, this is necessarily an elite project and a minority project. This is not a project that can work for different societies in different places because the enabling conditions are absent. So you will see historically that it has worked best in countries which managed to accumulate enough wealth and power where these ideas could be realized, these ideals could be realized by large numbers of people within those countries.
So it's a luxury
and those countries
item.
happen to be in Western Europe. Yeah. They went out, they colonized, they were already doing it while these people are formulating these ideas. And they're all part of the same complex. These people are not doing it in a vacuum. That these ideas were being formulated as these countries were growing and expanding, finding new territories elsewhere and resources. And so the notion that everyone in the world can aspire to fulfill these ideals is a fatal contradiction. So what I'm pointing to are the tensions and contradictions in the modern project. I'm not taking any sides. I'm not on Rousseau's side. I'm not on Voltaire's side. I'm saying that we have to be aware that this project emerged in very special conditions, very special circumstances, with a kind of universalist rhetoric, except that it was not universal in application. It arrived in large parts of the world, as Ian said, as imperialism, as a project of emancipation, which basically was interested in extracting commodities and resources from these places, large parts of Asia and Africa. So this project of emancipation, call it modernity, global capitalism, whatever, was felt as something deeply ambiguous by everyone in these places, even as they were seduced by this appeal, like many of us were, that here is something that offers a new way of being in the world, which is hugely emancipatory. And there are, obviously, genuine progress has been made by embracing those ideas. But at the same time, we have to recognize that people, 1.4 billion people in India, or billions more elsewhere, will not be able to realize those ideas, especially when those ideas are connected with the project of economic growth, private prosperity, that you find fulfillment through, or individual fulfillment or distinction or singularity through acquisition or consumption. This whole thing becomes unsustainable.
Mm-hmm. So is it a promise that's not sort of delivered, not fulfilled, that makes people angry? Is that what
I'm saying, that there's
anger?
A massive disconnect between the promise of equality, the promise of liberty, and the fact that people everywhere find that there are structural constraints in their way. The pressures of history, structural inequalities, injustices, all kinds of things that prevent them from fulfilling those ideals. And so over time, and this is a book about, it's not a history book, it's a book about particular conjunctures, that there are particular moments in modern history where this kind of rage, this kind of disaffection erupts, producing eerily similar phenomena, eerily similar rhetoric. Strongmen arriving, offering to sort things out, scapegoating minorities with exactly the same kind of language. In India, we hear the same language that was heard in the late 19th century for the first time in Europe. Rootless cosmopolitans, liberals, transnational minorities, conspiracies. This language is being used there. So it's not just this connection, that the Hindu nationalists are derived from fascist movements. It's the fact that this language, which is a kind of spontaneous language, is being heard there. And it all comes out of this experience of frustration. And that was the experience of Germany, that was the experience of Italy, that you have been promised modernization, industrialization, wealth, national wealth, and then things are not happening. There are a series of crises. There's a crisis of the nation state. There are any number of economic crises which you can't control because they are truly international. So we move further and further away from this original promise of liberty and equality. Capitalism becomes too complicated, nation states become too large, and so this original promise, which is of these men in Paris and Scotland and in America, people in pre-industrial age, let's not forget that, with no idea what will happen in the 19th century, how complex our political and economic structures grow. They have a dream of liberation. They have a dream of freedom, which many of them fulfill. But the notion that we should remain faithful to that particular dream, because it's a universalist dream, without thinking about the social circumstances, the environmental constraints, most importantly, today, that exist on fulfilling those kinds of dreams, especially the way in those dreams have been formulated today in recent decades.
Okay, Ian, do you agree that it's a feeling of being left behind,
of promises unfulfilled? Because I don't think you can say that the ideas of the Enlightenment are the same as those of modern notions of global capitalism. I mean,
they're not. I'm not saying that at all, actually. I'm saying that there is actually, they did not know what was going to happen, that their ideas of liberty and freedom would be adapted in different circumstances, tied to different kinds of goals. They did not, they talked about trade, they talked about commerce as a civilizing influence, but they did not think that global capitalism would emerge as this force which would disrupt people's lives radically in different parts of the world.
But if we say that, and we also then go back to Weimar Germany and say what happened in Germany was because of promises that were destroyed by the economic crisis and so on, we're throwing all kinds of things into a great big pot and sort of then drawing some big conclusion from it, which seems to me perhaps slightly mistaken, because what happened in Germany cannot be reduced to disappointment about economic crises. It had to do with World War I, it had to do with Versailles, it had to do with an older history, which indeed has something to do with the counter-enlightenment that came from the Napoleonic invasions. There is some truth to that. But I think you're putting too many things together which don't so neatly fit. And it reminds me, I mean, that aspirations for emancipation, secularization, and so on have all kinds of consequences that may sometimes be undesirable. We don't disagree about that. That's clearly true. But should we then conclude that we should not try and emancipate people from the revealed truth as it is imposed by priests, wherever they are? No, it doesn't mean that. And that reminds me of another debate.
Who is we here?
Well, anybody.
Who's we?
It reminds me of well, let's take a non-Western example. In Singapore, in the 1980s, which was one of the wealthiest countries in Asia, so it had nothing to do with disappointed economic aspirations and so on. The main critique of Western ideas of liberalism and democracy and individual freedom came from Singapore and Malaysia, which happened to be among the more affluent countries in Asia. And the critique was that we are different, these ideas may work in the West. It's a little bit analogous to what you're saying. It may work in the West, it came from specific historical circumstances, the fact that they have liberal democracy in America and Britain and so on, that's one thing, but it doesn't fit in our society. We have different traditions, we have traditions of individual obedience to authority, of collective rights rather than individual rights and so on. That was their line. And,
but what was it against?
Let me finish. It was against liberal democry. Because,
but who was formulating liberal democracy?
Let me just finish my thought. So this was the line, and it was very much, in my view, a justification of the people who were in power, in this case Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and Mahathir in Malaysia, to justify their kind of authoritarian regime. Now, the most cogent critique of Lee Kuan Yew's Asian values, which is what he called it, because he couldn't very well call it Chinese values, because there were other ethnic groups in Singapore and he didn't want to offend them, came from Kim Dae-jung in South Korea, who wrote a riposte to this and said, who's he to tell us that Asians shouldn't aspire to liberal democracy and individual freedoms and so on? We are Asians. That's exactly what we want. And who's he to define what are Asian values and so on? And he said, quite literally, he said, maybe these ideas did come from the West. If we can benefit from them, so much the better.
The rhetoric of Asian values, where you can agree upon, that's an entirely, again, another elite offering a kind of self-legitimizing discourse, saying that this is what really is what we are institutionalizing in our society, justifying their own power, and in this case, justifying a despotic regime. But we have to also acknowledge that a lot of this kind of rhetoric, Asian values, has been around for a long time, first of all. He's not the first person to say that. It was the Japanese who started this rhetoric, and before them, also Indians, also Chinese, this sort of notion that Asia represents a different way of being in the world. But what I'm trying to say, what was it in response against? What was it responding to? It was the rhetoric of universalism, that one way works best for everyone. This is what, Ian, I'm trying to say, is that this thing doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. All these people, and Singapore, India, all these cases are people who have suffered imperialism, who suffered racial humiliation, who were told that they are inferior, that their Asian values are crap, that the Western way is the best. So what we see is a kind of defensiveness which then becomes a kind of justification of all kinds of despotic regimes. We see that today in China. We see that everywhere. But what really starts this whole process is this rhetoric of universalism, that one thing that works for one kind of person in one part of the world can work for everyone else. And that is then imported through the process of imperialism, setting off this whole thing that we call modern history today, where people respond to it with different kind of self-serving statements. This is what I'm trying to point out.
No, I don't disagree with you on that. I mean, the one system should fit all, which again has deep roots in Christianity, in monotheistic religion, but which was also, of course, espoused by communists. I mean, and I agree that is a pernicious way of thinking, which causes enormous amounts of suffering. But Lee Kuan Yew, you remember the anecdote that Lee Kuan Yew was very much English educated, like Nehru, who was also known as Harry Lee. He received the British Foreign Secretary once, Brown, in the Wilson government in the 60s, and got up and made a speech when he was receiving Brown, who was probably already quite drunk. And Lee Kuan Yew then sort of gave this tirade against how Britain, that had once been a country of such order and discipline, had become horribly decadent and was an example of the decline of the West and so on. And after he'd finished, and he sat down, and Brown sort of lurched to his feet and said, "Harry, you're the greatest Englishman east of Suez."
But that's the other thing, is that people who, propose this special identity for themselves, which is defined as something completely different from the other, in this case the West, are people who themselves are internally colonized. They have taken on what the Asian values rhetoric is essentially a reworked version of the liberal universalist rhetoric. This is the interesting thing which I've tried to talk about in the book, that all these Hindu nationalists, they are kind of mirroring the so-called other. They're constantly doing it because they are completely fascinated by this figure who has so much power, whose rhetoric is so compelling, personally compelling. So in their own production of their identity, they take over this kind of rhetoric, and they become, internal sort of, in a way, kind of spiritual Englishmen.
Now let's move to the West. Does this process work the same way in Middle America, for instance, that people feel that they're not that universalism doesn't bring what it was promised to them?
Well, it's not so much universal rhetoric, it's universal processes in the case of the working classes of the United States, where they find or see a cosmopolitan elite centered in the coastal areas of the United States, basically taking decisions that benefit them, and indeed various other cosmopolitan elites around the world, leaving these people essentially defenseless. So that is the backlash that Donald Trump has basically led.
But when you say that they're taking
and specifically
decisions,
attacking cosmopolitan elites, in his rhetoric.
But when you say that these cosmopolitan elites are taking decisions benefiting only them, let's take Obamacare, for instance. That's something that was that was thought out by a cosmopolitan elitist guy in the White House, but it was meant to actually make life better for a lot of people. So how does that transpire? Why was there so many anger about
Sheila,
this?
we're not really talking about rational self-interest here. We're not talking about people acknowledging who might be the person or the leader best equipped to give them what they want. We're talking here about suffering, about people lashing out, demagogue arriving to identify particular scapegoats, enemies. This is a situation that has occurred over and over again in history. So this is not a question of people thinking rationally, pursuing their self-interest, using their individual reason, using the discoveries of science. This is why we kind of live in this post-Enlightenment world, where all these notions have fallen by the wayside. The idea of a well-educated citizenry, when you have mass media false news, fake news, propaganda all the time. Social media, you have so many forces acting upon individual minds. So this project of individual reason, individual autonomy is in danger like never before. And so it's in this context that you can persuade people that it's these people who are responsible for your plight, who don't care about you, who just care about each other. And
but that's what you're saying too. So you agree with them?
I'm not
because you were saying that cosmopolitan elites in the two coasts only care about themselves, and don't really care about these people who are suffering.
But the problem is, and this is what I think people who are on neither of these sides have to recognize, that there's a lot of truth in their accusation. That there are these elites created by, especially the last 3 decades of rapid globalization. These are facts that everyone knows. You know, this is not in doubt that globalization has benefited largely this tiny minority, helped the rich get much richer, that social mobility is blocked for many people, and that in America is one of the most unequal countries in the world today, and the people who have benefited are people who have managed to connect themselves to global processes. So there is a lot of truth in this, that the benefits of globalization have been cornered by a minority, and that minority happens to be the most well-educated, even if they're not in coastal, all of them are in coastal areas, happen to be the most well-educated.
So the people will write to throw the rascals out.
They are not completely wrong. They're not completely wrong. So this is where I think demagogues essentially reap their harvest, that there is, in the lived experience of many people, many actual truths that they run with, mix them with falsehoods, and present this very seductive cocktail to the masses. So there are these real truths about their situation, that inequality has been really, really obscene, especially in Britain and the United States.
Except if you look at the crowds that adore Donald Trump in his rallies, they tend not to be the very poor or the downtrodden. They tend to be middle-class white people, usually of a certain age, whose rage is partly against the urban elites and the educated and so on.
And the black man in the White House.
Well, against people who are poorer than them.
Yeah.
So, but let's agree to disagree about the sort of history of the Enlightenment and so on. If the ideas that come from that and the aspirations towards more individual liberty, secularization, less dependence on revealed truth, and all the rest of it, if these have had such undesirable results, what alternative would you propose? Because one alternative is indeed a sort of neo-traditionalist rhetoric that you get a bit in China, sort of reintroducing Confucianism, or at its crudest, it's sort of, we want our country back and make America great and so on. But how do you see that? I mean, what kind of politics would you propose as an alternative to the aspiration towards more individual liberty and more democracy?
Well, I actually want to diagnose the problem correctly. And, you keep saying that the ideas come from there. What I'm saying that those ideas were proposed by a tiny minority for itself. And then those ideas became attached to all kinds of different processes in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and most recently in the last 3 decades. So it's not like I keep insisting, there isn't a through line between the ideas of the Enlightenment and the present. What we see are different periods in which this modern project of emancipation assumes different forms, which is not to say that the modern project of emancipation should be abandoned.
Pankaj,
the challenge is to make it available for people for whom it was not originally meant.
But isn't that what has been tried?
But if there's no straight line, why bring in Rousseau and Voltaire and so on?
Because
why not just talk about neoliberalism?
Well, that is when these ideas are first formulated. It's the radical moment in history when ideas of individual autonomy, of equality, these are absolutely radical ideas. These are proposed.
Right.
That is the first time.
Okay.
So we are agreed upon this, that the modern world, or what we call modernity, begin to assume this form in the late 18th century.
Okay.
That is the general consensus intellectually.
So let's say we criticize that. This has had undesirable consequences. What alternative kind of politics would you then espouse?
Well, if what I'm trying to say is that this particular rhetoric of universalism that connects the Enlightenment, that all these ideas come from there, and that this is something that everyone else should be doing, this has been dominant around the world. I mean, let's recognize that this has had the kind of power and influence that no other ideology, no other neo-traditionalism or whatever has. So you're not really, when you're asking me to propose solutions, you're basically asking fish in the water to say, is there any other place where you can swim?
No, not solutions.
This is the world we live in. This is the world created by Western universities.
So there's no alternative? Is that what you're saying?
Well, where is the alternative?
This is the world, and this is
the world we live in. This is what I'm trying to say.
You're saying there's no alternative.
Well, what can be the alternative? Well, how can fish climb out of water?
Well,
we've tried different systems. We've tried radical equality in communism. We've tried different types of systems.
I mean, this is what we end up doing. This is what I'm saying, that with communism, with political Islam, with Hindu nationalism, all we are doing is sort of running up these mirror images of these ideologies. Look at the limited repertoire here.
But then, Pankaj, you're saying Fukuyama is right. It's the end of history.
Well, it's interesting that history
and the end of ideas,
was,
actually.
That declaration, original formulation was that history ended when Napoleon got up on his horse. Right. That was the original formation that Fukuyama ran with. Right. And that is a correct one.
I don't think it is correct.
That is a correct one.
I don't think it is correct.
In the sense that
the world changes constantly.
In the sense that this kind of rhetoric, which of course Napoleon most vigorously advanced, this notion of universalism, which he was the first to impose through violence, through mass murder on large parts of Europe, also in Egypt.
And emancipated the Jews and created laws and so on from which we still benefit.
Mass murderers have done a lot of good things.
No, that's not. But he
did. Hitler made trains run on time. We can't credit them for different achievements.
Yeah, no, but that is.
Nevertheless, the point is that he was the first one to advance this universalist ideology, which is now everywhere. And all we see everywhere are its mirror images.
Okay.
So how can we even talk about alternatives?
Well, but I think Napoleon is an interesting thing to talk about because, yes, a lot of people were killed as a consequence of his military campaigns, but his brand of
millions, not a lot.
Well, his brand of universalism is actually something that, in this country as well as other countries, we still benefit from. The idea of equality for the law and so on did come from them. The emancipation of minorities did come from them. And so that was precisely because he had an idea of the universality of rights and that not just one particular elite or one particular people deserved rights, but that it was a universal concept. Now, if your argument is that there's something fatally flawed about that, I'm not asking for a solution. I mean, that would be ludicrous. But I'd like to find what you think is an alternative way of thinking that could change things in countries for the better.
Well, exactly what I'm saying, which is that we have to first acknowledge that universalist solutions do not work.
Yeah.
That projects,
then what's the next step?
Then you have to recognize that all of us, whichever part of the world we live in, are products of particular histories, that so much of our lives are shaped by our geographies, our histories, the way in which our nations have entered the modern world, whether it's losers or winners. These are facts we have to acknowledge. And so solutions, when people ask for solutions, it's like repeating the same mistakes again. It's like, you can only expect me to offer a universal solution. All I can really talk about is the village that I've known for the last 20 years. If you ask me for solutions for that, how to improve the lives of 2,000 people living there, I might have some ideas about what can work. Industrialization won't work for them. Urbanization won't work for them. This is intellectual hubris, that one should offer solutions basically repeating the same mistakes that have been made over and over again, of thinking that there are universal solutions, that people should dress in the same way, they should all consume in the same way, they should all acquire in the same way, they should all be part of necessarily an industrial economy. This has really been at the source of so much misery and suffering. That's why you see this landscape today full of unviable nation states, dysfunctional economies, or people just feeding themselves illusions, like in large countries like India, that we will be one day an industrial superpower. We missed the bus on that. We missed the boat on all of that.
Well, I think
so where do we go next? I mean, those are the questions we have to ask
Well, that's
ourselves.
what I'm asking you. But universalism, I think, has had very bad consequences and good consequences. And I'll remind you that it was at your house that we watched the Brexit results coming in. And both of us were very dismayed. Now, why many of us are dismayed about Brexit and about the attacks on the EU? Precisely because the people who were in favor of Brexit were using exactly these arguments. We have our own tradition in history in England. We're not part of the same continental European idea. The EU is one solution fits all. England doesn't fit in that. That's why we need to be liberated from Europe. And so it's exactly what you're saying. And it's also, of course, what Lee Kuan Yew was saying, that liberal democracy as a universal solution doesn't work. We have our own authoritarian tradition, that's our culture, and so on. Now, the problem with that is that those in Singapore or anywhere else in the non-Western world who disagree and say, we want individual freedom, we want the same kind of liberties they have in the Western world and more in other parts of the world, they're then dismissed by people who defend, in this case, the Asian values line, as somehow not being real Chinese or real Asians or real whatever it is. And, well, you have to then find an answer to that.
I think, taking sides in these arguments that are constantly erupting and thinking you are or I am on this side or other, that's actually, in a way, basically takes us to an impasse.
No, that's politics.
I think that is politics, but neither of us are politicians.
No, we think
we are obviously people responding to situations where we see that there are obviously problems with the project of globalization, to which people are responding out of an experience of suffering. Let's not forget that whether it's the young Indian who finds his way blocked, his social mobility after being lifted out of poverty or destitution, now finds that there are not enough jobs, he cannot educate himself properly, not to mention the employed factory worker in America who suddenly finds his job disappearing one fine day because the factory is relocated to China or Taiwan. That particular suffering, which is caused by these opaque forces of globalization, of capital moving from one country to another, that has provoked today a backlash that I completely do not subscribe to. But we have to diagnose the problem correctly. Rather than take one side or other. Right. Say, I'm on Lee Kuan Yew's side, or I'm on the British side, or on Universalist liberal side. Well, that there is a problem with both of them. That is what my role is as a writer, as an intellectual, not to take sides in this matter, but to constantly.
Sometimes you have to take sides.
Well, I do. I mean, of course, I'm against Brexit because I think it will unleash these forces of nationalism, which are going to be deeply destructive in all kinds of ways, economically and socially. We've already seen that in India. But that does not mean that I'm for Brussels.
Yeah, but I'm not sure the diagnosis is entirely correct, because the people who many of the people who voted for Brexit or who vote for Marine Le Pen or for Trump are not suffering. I mean, a lot of people who voted for Trump in America are people who are white people who deeply resented, they loathed Obama because they deeply resented him for representing representing something that scares them, which is that white people no longer are as privileged as they used to be. Obama was hated on the one hand for the reasons that you yourself quite rightly mentioned, that he was educated, he came from Hawaii, but he was educated in New York and so on. But he was also black, he was half African. And so the people who loathed him with a passion did not do so because they were suffering. They did so for other reasons. So the same thing with Brexit. A lot of people who feel that Britain can be great again and we should be rid of these foreigners and so on, did not do so because they were suffering. It's because they feel somehow challenged in their sense of superiority.
But I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying, I've talked about the different ways in ressentiment work. In fact, one of the major points that I'm making, that it's not just because of economic inequality. It also has to do with social inequality. It has to do with gaps in education and culture. One reason why so many rich people support Trump, or so many middle-class people support Trump, is that he expresses a kind of resentment and loathing of the liberal metropolitan elite who look down upon many Americans like themselves, or think they are vulgar and vulgar loudmouths. So he does successfully articulate a kind of resentment which is not entirely due to socio-economic deprivations. So we see that in India too. A lot of very well-off Indians support Modi because they dislike this older elite for its air of cultural superiority, of intellectual superiority. But breaking it down into just suffering this or suffering that, we have to still acknowledge that there is suffering there, that people are suffering from this global regime. Would you not say that? Right. Or would you completely dismiss that and say, no, there are other reasons for that?
No, not at all. If you made your argument based on the effects of Reagan-Thatcher neoliberalism and what happened after the late 1980s and how that's dislocated a lot of people and so on, I would be completely in agreement. Where I have my doubts is when you bring in too much disparate history into this, and I think it confuses the argument rather than illuminates it. That would be my
But didn't
critique.
we see, did we not see similar, I'm not the only one arguing this, Fritz Stern argued that, George Mosse argued that, all the major intellectual historians of Germany argued that. That is the work I'm drawing upon in this book. This particular ressentiment that we saw in late 19th century Germany, which was also not entirely rooted in economic inequality, it was rooted in social inequality, intellectual inequality. All these different emotions were at work there. So this notion that, that whatever is happening today is something only confined to the last 3 decades seems very strange.
Well,
2 world wars were fought in Europe among competitive nation states, aspiring for the same kind of things, which is national wealth and power, led by demagogues, manipulating masses in the same way that they are manipulating them today. So how can we deny that history which is essentially one of violence and torment for many, many people? Tens of millions of people died in that.
Let's take late 19th century Germany. Why was the resentment there so much stronger than, say, in Britain of that time? And if the reason was the wrong-headedness of universal aspirations to individual freedom and liberal democracy and so on, then you would expect it to have erupted in Britain much more than in Germany. Late 19th century Germany was an authoritarian state, and that rejected a lot of those ideas of liberal democracy and individual freedom and so on. So this is where I think the historical analogies
why did they reject
confusing.
it? Why did they reject it?
Why did they reject
liberal democracy?
Bismarck because they came from a Prussian military authoritarian tradition.
But what was the national project?
The national project was to make Germany great.
Germany as successful as Britain.
But that was later. That was in the early 20th century when they built up their navy.
But Ian, that is completely ahistorical. From the very beginning, and this is, again, I'm not the only one saying that. This is what the historians of Germany have said throughout. From the very beginning, from reunification onwards, the project was to catch up with Britain, industrially, militarily. The entire national project was based upon that. Responding again to imperialism, which had been hugely successful. What was Germany's project? To be as successful an empire as the British were.
True.
And in that process, all these feelings of humiliation, of left behind as a nation, of being scorned, by humiliated, all these stereotypes about the English we were talking about earlier, about the Jews, all these things started to come together.
But what's that got to do with Voltaire?
What do you think about Ian's analysis?
Well, I'm not saying it has anything to do with that.
But Voltaire and Rousseau...
Give us a chance to hear what Ian wants to say.
Okay, please, yeah.
No, I think we should give a chance to you, because we don't have that much time for questions.
No, just one last question to you. In Ian's analysis, he just said that the current revolt can also be explained as a white middle-aged men who are afraid that they're losing out, who are afraid that, because of the emancipation of others, they're losing their place in time and history. What's your opinion on that?
Well, this is the paradox about freedom that we have to understand. That we talk too glibly about these notions, that freedom is something always geographically constrained. So freedom can be in particular contexts, particular circumstances. In this case, what you've just mentioned is a classic case of one person's freedom colliding with another's. So you have one part of the world rising, becoming more prosperous, stronger, and the other person feels their freedom of maneuver increasingly cramped. So freedom is never really should be seen in absolute terms. It's always relative. So this is why we should explore more deeply some of these tensions and contradictions of the modern project, of liberation, of freedom. Because it immediately, when you see it working in history, you will see that these freedoms of a particular society, of a particular nation, immediately collide with some other part, especially when the world is as deeply interconnected as it is today. So this is, with globalization, we have really entered what Hannah Arendt called negative solidarity. Capitalism, technology, forcing us to inhabit the same sphere, making it more and more claustrophobic. And so this notion of freedom becomes hugely compromised in the process. This is why I think when we talk about alternatives, we have to first acknowledge these complex realities.
Now, Ian, talking about alternatives, you asked Pankaj about alternatives. No, I want to hear your alternative first. You just analyzed saying, well, it's also, it's people feeling disenfranchised and they don't recognize the country any longer. They revolt against the elites. What would be your solution or...
To what?
To the next step, to the anger. You talked about Brexit. You said, well, that's not only people are socially, economically deprived, but they also feel like they need to revolt against an elite, against Brussels, against outside forces.
Well, I think the revolt against the elites are a symptom and not the disease. The problem is that there are too many people in democracies who feel somehow disenfranchised. And I think that's partly to do because a lot of the party systems in many countries have become sclerotic. It's the same parties who keep on coming back. And this is why I think the Congress Party in India was indeed in power for too long. And so the optimistic view is that it's not, and maybe the election of Macron is a harbinger of possibly better times to come, and it may be a solution, that the parties are beginning to shift and different parties come up. The old party system will start to disappear, and we get new parties representing new interests. And the parties so far have been largely class-based. You had parties representing the business interests, you had parties representing the industrial working class, and so on. And since the economies have really changed, this no longer really reflects reality anymore. So different interests have to be represented politically by different kind of parties and different programs. And that's a painful process. But I think that is the only solution. I don't think that globalization or interdependence or international or the international, pan-national institutions and so on are necessarily the problem. I mean, I still believe in the EU. I think the EU is very flawed, and can be reformed and so on. And nor do I really believe it's the end of history. I mean, societies keep on changing, ideas change, new ideas come up, and so on. So I don't think we're all fish gasping for air underwater and there's no way to escape and so on. I'm not quite as pessimistic as that. And as far as and I think here we certainly have common ground, as far as wars and tensions erupting from powers coming up that are rubbing up against powers that are established, and Imperial Germany in the 19th century wanting to catch up with Britain, which led to violence and so on. That is, of course, true. But that goes back much further than Voltaire and Rousseau and so on. Empires have always rubbed up against each other, and kingdoms and so on have always fought over territory and over power and over sovereignty and all that kind of thing. And I don't think that has very much to do with sort of Western ideas developed in the 18th century. I mean, I think that's the history of mankind. But I'm not proposing to expand our historical discussions that.
Thank you so much. Let's open the floor for discussion. I think there's someone with a microphone walking around. Yeah, over there. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question or make a comment, or right there in the back?
Thank you for your words, interesting words. But I missed one word, solidarity. And that's what I like to ask you. We are so connected in the world nowadays. Marx said, workers of all the world unite.
People of all the world, yeah.
And we are not able to unite against this economic might which is working against, which is creating a world we don't like, we don't want to have, because we, as usual people, are not able to find a way to come out of this, sorry for my English, to come out from this terrible situation. How can we find solidarity?
How can we find solidarity? Who would you like an answer from?
No, that's here. That's for you.
But it is, I mean, I think it's a hugely neglected idea. We have invested too much in a kind of hyper-individualism in recent decades, and that has been the part of a larger assault on all kinds of collective projects of welfare, whether in post-colonial Asia and Africa, or indeed in post-45 Europe, that we have moved away from previous notions of solidarity, of kind of national communities developing, growing together, that there's been too much emphasis laid on private wealth creation, people pursuing their individual self-interests completely individually, and the expectation that they would create this wealth which will eventually trickle down. All of these theories have proven to be utterly false. So I do think we need to, rediscover these sort of principles of solidarity, which, were most vigorously formulated when the effects of capitalism were widely felt across 19th century Europe. When E.P. Thompson wrote about the working classes and their culture of solidarity, it was their culture of solidarity that softened some of the harshest edges of a capitalism that was uprooting and dispossessing many peoples. And I think today many people feel particularly exposed and powerless because those cultures, those institutions, whether it's trade unions or whether it's other intermediate institutions, things that stand between the individual and the world, and buffer, offer comfort to the individual, they've all gone missing. So we do need to, rediscover some of the virtues of solidarity, and it can assume, many different forms. Otherwise, we see it ground to the right, to the far right, or to the fundamentalists, who do offer solidarity, a very seductive offer, which many people take, which many people embrace.
But one could also argue that, maybe in the past, the working classes, there was more solidarity, but they were poorer, they were less healthy, they, nowadays they live longer, they have more money to spend, so they actually advanced in life.
They have more credit to spend.
Well,
sorry, go on.
No, I mean, we can agree that solidarity is a fine thing.
Absolutely.
So, but I think the history of post-1945 Europe is exactly the opposite from what you're saying, because the conclusion people draw from World War II is precisely to have welfare states, to have some kind of unification of Europe, to strengthen collective welfare in all kinds of ways, and that began to unravel, as I say, really in the 80s.
But that's 90s. Exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, but that's why I think your argument would be much stronger if you concentrated on that rather than. But we've been through this.
But again, you have to then ask Ian. You take these particular episodes out of context. Why was the need for collective welfare felt after 45? It was recognized, especially by Christian Democrats, that that old system of competition, of nation states competing with each other for scarce commodities, resources, this whole model, universalist model, had deep flaws, that we had let too much stress on certain.
But that wasn't a universalist novel. You're saying they were reacting against nationalist selfishness and so on. That's not universalist. That's the opposite.
No,
their solution was universalist. That we should.
But it's a universalist ideology which proposes competition among individuals, among nation states, as the way forward, as the way to progress.
Well, you mean social Darwinism?
This is social Darwinism, exactly what triumphed in the 19th century. And in reaction to that, the collective welfare project, social democracy, was constructed, that we cannot repeat those kinds of mistakes again. I do take this point that, of course, in the last 3 decades, that contract or that compact has unraveled. And one reason why we are in sore need of solidarity, a fine thing, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the reason it unraveled.
But the irony is that social Darwinism, I mean, and I'm pretty sure we won't disagree about that social Darwinism had its greatest appeal amongst intellectuals of the non-Western world. It had an enormous appeal in China, in Japan, and in India. The forerunners of Modi's movement, what you remember, biceps, Bhagavad Gita, and biceps and Bhagavad Gita, because they thought that to make the Indians virile again, they ought to eat beef like the British. But that whole idea of social Darwinism, and we have to fight to survive and so on, although indeed came from the West and had pernicious results, but became particularly strong in the anti-colonial movement.
You've just proven a point, that all these ideologies, whether political Islam, this is what I try to say in the book, which start to take shape in the late 19th century, Vivekananda, political Islam, even Buddhism. Buddhism gets formulated as a nationalist ideology that has to find a place for itself, has compete with other religious ideologies or nationalisms. So they are kind of mirroring each other. This is this sort of state of competition, what Arendt calls in our context negative solidarity, that these are constantly people borrowing from each other, mirroring each other. So when we talk about alternatives, that's something we have to remember, that these so-called alternatives were essentially versions of the same sort of thing.
Right.
But without going back to the fish
question.
in the water, I don't think we're ever going to see the end of the competitive instinct amongst human beings. I mean,
that's human being. We're going to take another question. The gentleman here in front.
I need a microphone.
Yes.
I think what you don't discuss enough about is the real contradiction between the American capitalism and the situation we have here in continental Europe. Because that's very different. We have a history that started about 100 years ago of socialism, social democrats that were fighting to have rights for the ordinary people, and they succeeded. So we have laws, etc. We don't accept poverty. Everyone has to have a financial basis, etc. That's what they don't do in the United States. And Tony Judd wrote about it, and he said, look, for instance, at violence. Violence is much more accepted in the United States than it is here in continental Europe. So I think there is a lot of hope. As Macron is elected, we have very much in common here in continental Europe, and I think that's a solution, at least for Europe, and maybe for more parts of the world.
Ian, would you like to comment?
Well, yeah, but I wouldn't exaggerate those differences because, I mean, countries have complicated histories and change and so on. The United States also had the New Deal at a time that Europe was in very bad shape. And Europeans had to escape to America to find a more equal and peaceful society. And after World War II, with the GI Bill and so on, there were a lot of political currents in the United States that were social democratic of a certain kind. Now, on the violence, and well, there are two things to be said. One thing, that Trump is wrong when he says that American cities have become more violent and so on, and cesspools of this and that. In fact, according to the statistics, crime in American cities has gone down enormously in the last 10, 15 years. Quite why? There are many possible explanations. There probably isn't one. But there is a real problem with guns. And that is rooted in American history. But again, the insistence now made by the National Rifle Association and people who support it, that not only should it be every American citizen's right to have a gun, but it should also be every citizen's right to have a howitzer. This is very recent. It's post-1960s, 70s. I mean, the consensus in America not so long ago was that was much less pro-gun than it is today. I mean, it's a real problem today. That's certainly true, and it's a problem that doesn't exist, thank goodness, in Europe. And you're right in that the United States is the only Western democracy where the state does not have the monopoly of force. That's correct.
But his point on political system, on the fact that, for instance, in Western Europe, we have much more social democratic systems, and we have the welfare state. So, and that's
for convenience sake, we assume Britain doesn't belong to Western Europe.
No. Continental Europe.
Well, the Dutch economic systems and views have not always been the same as those in Italy or Germany either. And there is a strong mercantile side to Dutch history, which is mostly concentrated in the coastal areas, which is very similar to the Anglo-Saxon outlook. And then you have, so I think it's more complex. I think it's too simple to say, here is the United States and this is continental Europe.
Okay, I agree with that. But there's a lot of, we have pluralism, so a lot of different opinions are accepted. But of course, it's very general to say so about continental Europe. I agree. And we had a lot of tensions last year, you know, about the popular parties, etc. But now, for some months, there's more hope in Europe that we can succeed in having so many things in common. And that we have in common that we don't want to be, don't want to have an American kind of capitalism.
But the Netherlands is still, the biggest party in the Netherlands is still the VVD, and they have liberal, in the continental European sense of the word, ideas which are very close to those of the Anglo-Saxon word. No?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, it's 10 o'clock. We have to wrap up.
Oh,
thank you. I would like to ask an applause for our speakers.
I hope you didn't mind me.
No, okay.
Thank you so much. Ja. Nou, dames en heren, dit was de laatste Be Unlimited voor de zomer. Ik wil nog dank vragen aan Anton Simonis voor de techniek. Of u hem ook graag even wil bedanken. En dan heb ik nog een paar huishoudelijke mededelingen. De volgende bijeenkomsten. De eerstvolgende is op zondagmiddag 3 september. Dan is het Haags Uitfestival. Dan zijn Writers Unlimited en Be Unlimited allebei aanwezig met een kraam. We verkopen dan kaartjes voor de programma's in september en oktober. En het eerstvolgende programma is op vrijdag 8 september. Dan organiseren ProDemos en partners voor de 7e keer de Nacht van de Dictatuur. Dan gaat in de bibliotheek aan het Spui, kunt u genieten van Ilja Leonard Pfeiffer en Özcan Akjol. Die gaan in gesprek met Jeroen Vullings over vrijheid en dictatuur. Absoluut een aanrader. En op vrijdag 29 september is de openingsavond van de Week van de Afrikaanse Roman. En dan hebben we een programma met een aantal Afrikaanse auteurs. Ook zeer aan te bevelen. Alles staat op de website en Facebook van Be Unlimited, dus kijk vooral. En achter in de zaal kunt u werken van beide auteurs van vanavond aanschaffen. En ze zijn ook nog beschikbaar uiteraard voor gesprekken en eventueel signeren. Dank u wel.